In early 2026, a quiet, seemingly routine Pentagon budget approval sent shockwaves through the global defense ecosystem. A $1 billion dedicated counter drone air defense package, branded as the ultimate solution to defeat modern swarm drone warfare, vetted by top military analysts, greenlit for rapid global deployment, was hailed as the final answer to decade long battlefield vulnerabilities. For months, military media outlets celebrated the program as a paradigm shift, a state of the art, fully integrated defense system designed to neutralize cheap, attritable enemy drones, secure forward operating bases, and neutralize asymmetric warfare threats that had plagued Western coalition forces for years. Governments across NATO and Indo Pacific allies rushed to align with the upgrade, pouring supplementary funding into integration training, base retrofits, and operational readiness drills. To every casual observer and mainstream defense commentator, this billion-dollar investment was a foolproof military upgrade, a guaranteed force multiplier for 21st century combat. However, in a single 72-hour simulated theater combat trial, the entire $1 billion defense architecture collapsed catastrophically. Not from a lack of firepower, not from enemy technological superiority, and not from poor troop execution. It failed because of one single overlooked structural mistake embedded in the core system design, a microscopic strategic flaw that turned a cutting-edge defense program into a global military trap. The trial results stunned Pentagon auditors, defense contractors, and strategic planners alike. The billion-dollar system was not just ineffective. It actively degraded Allied battlefield capabilities, exposed forward bases to targeted enemy exploitation, and created a systemic vulnerability that adversarial powers had spent years waiting to exploit. In an instant, the rules of modern asymmetric warfare shifted entirely. One budgetary oversight, one technical miscalculation, one misplaced assumption about enemy tactics erased $1 billion of military investment and rewrote global defense strategy overnight. But the real danger was never the system's visible flaws. It was the hidden strategic loophole that adversaries had already identified long before the first unit deployed, a loophole the Pentagon's rushed procurement process and bureaucratic red tape deliberately ignored to meet deployment deadlines. What was marketed as a revolutionary defensive upgrade was, in reality, a pre-engineered trap primed to cripple Western air defense resilience the moment global conflict escalated. To understand the $1 billion trap, we must first dissect the flawed strategic logic that birthed the program. For the past decade, Western military doctrine has fixated on counter-small unmanned aircraft systems as the top battlefield priority. The rise of cheap, mass-produced commercial drones modified for military use, costing as little as $20,000 per unit, has overwhelmed traditional air defense grids, forcing the Pentagon to divert massive funding to develop intercept capabilities capable of neutralizing drone swarms. The 2025 fiscal year's $956 million CES funding surge, rounded to a $1 billion operational deployment package, was framed as a desperate necessary pivot from legacy air defense systems to decentralized electronic warfare-focused protection. The hidden strategy behind this move was twofold and exclusively beneficial to peer adversarial nations. First, the Pentagon's bureaucratic rush to field a rapid solution created a fatal procurement compromise. Military planners prioritized deployment speed over systemic interoperability, forcing contractors to streamline software integration tests, skip long-term durability stress trials, and standardize hardware on outdated battlefield communication protocols. The goal was simple: field thousands of Mobile Seas UAS units across forward bases within 18 months to counter emerging swarm threats. In doing so, they sacrificed cross-system data synchronization, layered defense redundancy, and resistance to advanced electronic jamming tactics. Second, adversarial strategic analysts closely tracked every stage of the program's development, recognizing the West's critical doctrinal shift. While the U.S. and its allies poured billions into kinetic and electronic drone intercept systems, peer powers abandoned direct drone swarm competition. Instead, they developed a specialized counter-CSUAS suppression doctrine tailored explicitly to exploit the Pentagon's rushed system flaws. This was not a random tactical adjustment, it was a years-long strategic waiting game. Adversaries allowed the West to sink $1 billion into a rigid, single-purpose defense system, knowing its core design limitations would render it useless against modified, next-generation drone tactics. Everything changed when adversarial defense agencies finalized their low-cost suppression counterplay. They did not build superior drones, they built drone decoys, frequency-hopping jammers, and signal spoofing modules designed exclusively to overload and confuse the $1 billion seized UAS network. The entire Western defense investment was engineered to target old generation, unmodified drone swarms. The new adversarial counter technology rendered every sensor, every jammer, every intercept missile in the billion-dollar arsenal functionally obsolete. Strategically, this trap is unparalleled in modern defense history. Adversaries forced the West to spend $1 billion on a self-neutralizing defense system, creating a one-sided battlefield advantage with minimal investment of their own. Worse still, the strategic trap extends far beyond technical obsolescence. By standardizing global allied defense around this flawed CSUAS architecture, the Pentagon locked dozens of partner nations into a shared vulnerable network. Every allied base that adopted the billion-dollar upgrade now shares the same systemic flaw, creating a single point of failure for entire regional defense theaters. What began as a unilateral U.S. procurement mistake evolved into a global strategic vulnerability cascade. To fully grasp the magnitude of this trap, we break down the technical specifications of the 2025-2026 CSUAS defense package, the core of the billion-dollar investment, and isolate the single mistake that collapsed its entire operational value. The full $1 billion program consisted of three integrated hardware tiers, paired with proprietary defense software and battlefield networking infrastructure. Tier 1, Mobile Electronic Warfare Jamming Nodes 420M allocation. This tier comprised 1,200 vehicle-mounted and portable EW jamming units designed to detect, track, and neutralize commercial and military drone radio frequencies across 2.4 GHz, 5.8 GHz, and military band spectrum. The units were engineered for wide area coverage, capable of blanket jamming a 12-kilometer operational radius to disable drone command and control links. Technically, the hardware itself was functionally sound for legacy drone threats. The fatal flaw resided in its fixed spectrum detection algorithm. To accelerate deployment, contractors hard-coded the system to recognize only known pre-2025 drone frequency signatures, eliminating adaptive frequency scanning machine learning modules that would have allowed the system to identify novel signal patterns. This cost-cutting, speed-focused modification saved 11 months of algorithm refinement and $87 million in development costs, but it eliminated the system's ability to counter modified adversarial drones. PurePower's new drone systems integrate random frequency hopping modulation, cycling through over 900 unregistered spectrum channels per second, entirely outside the fixed database of the billion-dollar jamming nodes. The EW units cannot detect, track, or jam these signals, rendering 42% of the total investment completely non-functional against modern threats. Tier 2 Kinetic Mini Missile Interceptor Systems 380M allocation. The second tier included 4,500 miniature high-velocity intercept missiles designed to physically destroy incoming low-altitude drone swarms. Each interceptor cost approximately $84,000 to produce, engineered for precision proximity detonation to eliminate small, agile drone targets without collateral damage. The technical failure here is a threshold targeting limitation baked into the missile guidance software. To reduce processing latency and improve reaction time for fast-moving swarms, programmers set a minimum radar cross-section targeting threshold of 0.01 square meters. Adversarial engineers exploited this exact parameter. New adversarial microdrones are manufactured with molded carbon fiber composite bodies and folded airframe designs that reduce their RCS to 0.004 square meters, well below the system's detection floor. The billion-dollar kinetic intercept tier cannot lock onto, track, or engage these microdrones. Compounding the wasteful cost imbalance, the U.S. military deploys $84,000 interceptors to counter $20,000 enemy drones, a fiscal and tactical mismatch that drains defense budgets while failing to neutralize threats. In battlefield terms, this turns a defensive system into an economic and operational liability. Tier 3, Theater Network Integration and Command Software, 200M allocation. The final tier funded cloud-based battlefield networking software designed to sync all jamming nodes, intercept batteries, and early warning sensors into a single unified defense grid. The critical mistake here is centralized data processing architecture. The entire system routes all sensor data through a limited number of forward theater command servers, rather than utilizing decentralized edge computing. This design was chosen to reduce field hardware costs and simplify troop training, but it created a catastrophic single point of failure. Adversary electronic warfare teams now deploy low-power, wide-area signal saturation tools that flood the centralized server data pipelines with false sensor returns. The billion-dollar network cannot distinguish real drone threats from synthetic decoys, overwhelming command terminals, freezing target acquisition systems, and locking out human operator overrides. Within 90 seconds of sustained adversarial signal saturation, the entire regional CS UAS defense grid shuts down completely blind, unresponsive, and incapable of defending critical assets. Collectively, these three technical compromises, fixed spectrum algorithms, RCS threshold limitations, and centralized networking, form the one mistake that changed everything. What was marketed as a next generation all domain drone defense system is exclusively effective against obsolete pre 2025 drone technology. Against current adversarial modified systems, the $1 billion defense grid is functionally inert. To illustrate the real world combat impact of this billion-dollar trap, we analyze a full spectrum 2027 Indo Pacific theater war simulation conducted by independent defense analysts and verified by retired U.S. Army air defense commanders. The simulation uses real system technical limitations, adversarial countertactics, and standard allied deployment protocols to replicate a realistic high intensity conflict scenario. Simulation, a scenario, 72-hour regional asymmetric conflict, and there are already Indo-Pacific Forward Operating Base Theater Phase 1, pre-conflict posturing of route. Allied forward bases in the Indo-Pacific activate full defensive readiness, engaging the newly deployed $1 billion C-Series defense grid. All jamming nodes, missile intercept batteries, and network sensors are online and calibrated to standard operational protocols. Allied intelligence reports no immediate large-scale drone threats, relying entirely on the upgraded defense system for early warning and intercept capability. Troop readiness status is listed as maximum operational capability based on the system's advertised performance metrics. Phase 2, Adversary, Opening Suppression, 1218. Without launching a single offensive drone strike, adversarial EW units initiate low-level spectrum saturation across the theater. The fixed spectrum CS-UAS jamming nodes fail to detect the frequency hopping signal interference. Centralized command servers begin ingesting tens of thousands of synthetic drone decoy signatures. Within 6 hours, the defense network's target processing queue is overloaded by 97%. Human operators attempt manual override, but the centralized server architecture locks out independent local system control to preserve network synchronization, a core programmed feature of the billion-dollar integration software. Phase 3. Trap activation and defense collapse, 1824. Everything changed when the adversary launched the first wave of low RCS microdrone swarms, totaling 800 modified units. The CS-UAS radar systems failed to register the microdrones due to the 0.01 Muffin-Town RCS threshold limitation. No intercept missiles fire, no jamming signals engage. The billion-dollar defense grid registers 0 incoming threats while enemy drones penetrate base perimeters undetected. The microdrones execute precision strikes on radar emplacements, fuel depots, and communication towers, neutralizing physical backup defense assets before conventional enemy forces advance. Phase 4, Theater-Wide Vulnerability Cascade, 24/7. With the primary CS-UAS grid blinded and key defensive infrastructure destroyed, adversarial conventional drone swarms and cruise missile strikes follow unimpeded. Allied short-range air defense systems, which were deprioritized and partially decommissioned to fund the billion-dollar upgrade, lack the coverage to fill the defensive gap. The simulation records an 89% reduction in Allied-based defensive survivability and a 76% increase in successful enemy strike missions across the theater. Most critically, the standardized Allied defense architecture means every adjacent Allied base suffers identical failures, creating a regional defensive domino effect that cannot be reversed in real time. The simulation's final verdict is definitive. The $1 billion defense investment did not merely fail to improve battlefield security. It actively degraded pre-existing defensive capabilities by diverting funding, phasing out legacy backup systems, and locking forces into a flaw-ridden, adversary exploitable defense framework. This is not a minor operational setback. It is a systemic theater-level defense collapse triggered entirely by one avoidable technical and strategic mistake. The fallout from the $1 billion trap extends far beyond wasted defense funding or failed battlefield trials. This single procurement error has reshaped global military balance, altered alliance defense posturing, and rewritten the rules of 21st century asymmetric warfare with long-term geopolitical repercussions that will persist for decades. Consequence 1. Massive Western defense diminishing returns and budget erosion. Modern U.S. defense spending has long suffered from diminishing returns, with trillion-dollar budget thresholds failing to deliver proportional force modernization. The $1 billion Seize UAS failure exemplifies the core crisis of Western military procurement: bureaucratic speed prioritization over technical rigor, contractor cost-cutting on critical system redundancies, and a disconnect between doctrinal planning and adversarial adaptive tactics. This wasted investment forces allied nations to divert additional billions in emergency supplementary funding to retrofit and replace the flawed systems, creating a perpetual cycle of reactive defense spending with zero net capability gain. Unlike peer adversarial nations' cost efficient, tactic adaptable military development, Western defense infrastructure now prioritizes expensive, rigid, single purpose systems vulnerable to targeted enemy exploitation. Consequence 2: Allied alliance trust deficit and defense fragmentation. Dozens of NATO and Indo Pacific allied nations invested secondary funding in base retrofits, troop training, and integration support for the US led CESUS UAS program. Many smaller allies depleted limited defense budgets to align with what was billed as a universal global defense standard. The catastrophic system failure has eroded core alliance trust in U.S. defense procurement oversight and technical validation. Moving forward, allied nations will hesitate to adopt unified U.S. led defense upgrades, opting for independent localized defense solutions instead. This fragments collective regional defense grids, eliminates cross alliance interoperability, and weakens unified deterrence against peer adversarial threats. Consequence 3: Adversarial tactical and strategic dominance in asymmetric warfare. Peer powers have now validated a proven low-cost playbook to neutralize multi-billion-dollar Western defense systems. Their strategy is brutally efficient: allow Western nations to overinvest in rigid, fixed-spec defense hardware, then develop low-cost technical countermeasures to render those systems obsolete. The $1 billion trap has emboldened adversarial military planners to double down on asymmetric suppression technology, including advanced signal spoofing, low RCS micro-drone manufacturing, and adaptive frequency warfare tools. For the next 5 to 8 years, adversarial forces will hold definitive tactical dominance in drone and electronic warfare domains, with no Western counter solution currently in full operational development. Consequence 4: Global defense procurement paradigm shift. The era of expensive, hardware-centric Western defense modernization is officially collapsing. The $1 billion trap exposes the fatal flaw of traditional defense procurement: prioritizing physical firepower over adaptive software, decentralized resilience, and adversarial counter-tactic forecasting. Global military powers are now rapidly shifting funding away from large-scale fixed system hardware purchases and toward iterative, software-defined, decentralized defense architectures. Nations that fail to adapt will continue sinking billions into obsolete, exploitable military infrastructure, while agile, adaptive defense frameworks define future warfare superiority. And consequence 5: Elevated great power conflict risk. The temporary asymmetric warfare gap created by the $1 billion trap increases the risk of miscalculation and limited great power escalation. Adversarial nations now possess a verified, undefeatable method to bypass Western air defense systems in regional theaters, creating a power imbalance that tempts tactical aggression. Western forces, aware of their defensive vulnerability, may overcompensate with aggressive forward posturing to deter exploitation, raising the risk of accidental skirmishes spiraling into full-scale conflict. This single procurement mistake has directly destabilized global deterrence equilibrium,